Welcome to Fulcrum Intel Digest. This is Season 1, Episode 19. If you're looking for a clear, concise pathway through, well, the pretty dense political, security, and economic crises shaping West Africa right now, you are absolutely in the right place.
Yeah, it's a really tangled situation over there.
It really is. Today, we're undertaking quite an intense deep dive into a devastating paradox. This stated pursuit of better governance, but using entirely unconstitutional, often violent means. We're talking about the military coup.
It's a subject that demands immediate and frankly rigorous analysis. Our source material today, it's proprietary analysis from Fulcrum Analytics, and it explores how this recent surge of military coups is fundamentally justified, or at least claimed to be justified, by the leaders' professed desire for something they call true governance.
Right, true governance.
Exactly. And our mission today is essentially to take a stack of hard data, security indexes, corruption rankings, democratic metrics, and rigorously measure these new regimes against their own stated goals.
Absolutely. We're looking for proof, really. Are these coups actually beneficial in any measurable way, or is it, as some of the preliminary data suggests, that the political cure they're administering is proving far worse than the original disease of, poor governance?
We're going to unpack key data points on the worsening insecurity, this persistent corruption, and fundamental electoral failure.
And critically, we'll connect this historical context directly to some breaking intelligence on recent and frankly alarming terrorist expansion in the region. It all ties together.
We'll provide you with the necessary sort of intellectual tools to understand the current political fault lines, not just in the volatile Sahel, which gets a lot of attention, but how that instability seems to be, metastasizing across the entire West African bloc.
Yeah, it's spreading.
It really is.
Yeah.
This deep dive is pretty essential if you want to stay ahead of the narrative, to understand what's actually happening on the ground beyond the headlines.
Definitely. And before we dive into all that data, if you appreciate this kind of focused, data-driven analysis and on-the-ground intelligence, please take just a moment right now to subscribe and maybe like this episode.
Yeah, it genuinely helps us tremendously in continuing to bring you these essential intelligence briefings week after week. We appreciate the support.
We really do. Okay, so let's begin by defining this aspiration. True governance. This is the goal the juntas claim they're fighting for, right? So we need to understand its academic and, maybe more importantly, its practical implications.
Exactly. This concept, it goes far beyond just, having a stable government on paper. It really requires a profound restructuring of the relationship between the state and its people.
So in the academic framework we're using, and this draws from theorists like John Pierre and Guy Peters, true governance is defined as, and I'm quoting here, the patterns and processes of rule that emerge in a society when the boundaries between state, market, and civic society become blurred, emphasizing accountability, participation, and legitimacy.
And that's a crucial distinction, isn't it?
Yeah.
It moves beyond just simple democratization, like holding an election. It's not enough for the state just to exist. It has to actively create room for democratic institutions. Think civil society organizations, a functioning market economy, independent media, to truly participate in the ruling process.
So participation is key.
Participation, accountability, and critically addressing the social and economic needs of the people efficiently and fairly. This departure from traditional governance, as the theory goes, promises not just stability, but actual efficacy and moral legitimacy. The government actually works for the people.
And the irony here, it couldn't be heavier, could it? This powerful, really deep-seated search for legitimacy and participation is exactly what our source material suggests has, quote, metamorphosed into the multiple coups that has plagued the region in post-colonial times.
It's a tragic paradox. The very tool being used to supposedly secure legitimacy of military takeover is itself inherently illegitimate under pretty much all regional and international law.
And the scope of this failure, this trend, it's staggering. West Africa has, unfortunately, really secured its status as the coup hotspot of the world.
Yeah, the numbers are stark. Since 2019, the region's been responsible for 2/3 of the continent's major power grabs. Think about that. 2 out of every 3 coups in Africa happened to West Africa.
Which specific countries are we talking about here?
Well, out of the 9 successful or attempted coups conducted in Africa since 2019, 6 occurred in West Africa. Yep. We're talking Mali, Niger, Guinea, Burkina Faso, And there was also the attempted coup in Guinea-Bissau.
It's not just isolated political instability then.
Not at all. It's really like a regional epidemic of unconstitutional change, a contagion almost.
And that kind of intense, cascading regional instability, it must force international bodies to constantly react, constantly redefine their response. Which brings us neatly to part one, the existing legal deterrents. If the situation is so volatile, surely there are strong regional and continental laws already in place designed specifically to prevent these military takeovers.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
What are these legal shields, and maybe more importantly, why are they apparently failing to hold the line?
You're right to focus on the legal framework first. The regional bodies, primarily the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the African Union, the AU, they've created what look, at least on paper, like pretty robust instruments to repress unconstitutional changes of power.
Okay.
These are explicitly designed to remove the political and, crucially, the economic scaffolding that a military regime needs to survive after seizing power.
Let's get specific then. Let's look at the teeth of these laws. What specific power does that ECOWAS protocol wield?
Right. So for ECOWAS, the primary instrument is the 2001 Supplementary Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance.
Right.
Article 1 of this protocol is really foundational. It actively promotes accession to power only through free and credible elections.
Right.
And it explicitly prohibits any unconstitutional change of power. But the crucial enforcement mechanism, the teeth, as you say, lies in Article 45.
Article 45. And what does that mandate in practice? What happens when a coup occurs?
Article 45 gives ECOWAS the power to impose immediate and potentially quite punitive sanctions. And this isn't just a strongly worded statement of verbal censure. It translates into concrete, often painful actions.
What?
Like closing borders with the offending nation, which can absolutely cripple vital trade flows, especially for landlocked countries. Suspending financial assistance, including essential budget support that many of these governments rely on, and politically isolating the regime within the regional bloc.
So the mechanism is basically an attempt at economic strangulation plus diplomatic isolation intended to force a rapid return to civilian rule.
That's the intention, yes. Immediate, painful economic and diplomatic consequences built right into the regional structure.
Okay, so that's ECOWAS, but then a coup happens anyway. So the question is, how does the African Union, the continental body, layer its own deterrent on top of that?
Right, the AU layers on what you could call a collective firewall, designed to cut the offending regime off from continental legitimacy. This is rooted in three major instruments. There's the Loan Declaration from 2000, the Constitutive Act of the African Union itself, and the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, usually known as ACDG, which was adopted in 2007.
That's quite a bit of a legal framework there. What do all these instruments actually mean for the generals, the colonels who seize power? What are the practical consequences from the AU?
Collectively, these documents achieve three critical deterrent effects. First, obviously, they prohibit unconstitutional change. No surprise there. Second, and this is really important, they explicitly impose an election ban on the individual perpetrators of the coup.
So the coup leader can't just take off his uniform and run for president later.
Precisely. It means the military leaders cannot simply shed their uniforms and run for president in the subsequent transitional election. It's a critical clause designed specifically to prevent the legitimization of illegitimacy. You can't shoot your way into power and then just vote yourself in.
Okay, that makes sense. And the third effect?
The third is the immediate suspension of the violating country from all AU activities. That includes things like voting rights within the AU, participation in summits, and access to AU development funds or programs. They are essentially cut off from continental political and financial processes.
Which limits their leverage internationally too, presumably, with bodies like the UN or the IMF.
Absolutely. It significantly damages their standing and makes it harder to secure international recognition or assistance.
Okay, let's try and unpack this essential paradox then. If the laws are so clear, so specific, and the consequences seem so immediate, we're talking suspensions, sanctions, election bans for the leaders, why have they apparently utterly failed to stall the coup plotters? Why are we still seeing this continuous flood of instability, especially concentrated in the Sahel?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer seems to be because the coup plotters deploy a counter-argument, a narrative, that resonates deeply with segments of the local populace. And crucially, this narrative seeks to delegitimize the very organizations like ECOWAS and the AU that are attempting to impose those sanctions.
How does that narrative work? What are they saying?
They collectively argue that they're not violating democracy for self-gain or just for power itself. Instead, they claim they're responding to a profound, sometimes existential, crisis of governance. One that the existing democratic structures, which they often portray as riddled with corruption, incompetence, maybe beholden to foreign interests, utterly fail to address.
So they present themselves not as rogue actors breaking the rules, but as necessary correctives. The only ones brave enough or strong enough to step in when the system fails, like a shortcut to achieving the effectiveness of that true governance we talked about.
Precisely. Their defense essentially boils down to, we were stepping in because the system was broken, it was rigged, and it was ignoring the people's core needs, especially security. This deep, often genuine frustration with failed civilian leadership, sometimes combined with very real security crises, gives the juntas a powerful, if often temporary, reservoir of public support, or at least public acquiescence.
Okay, so to test that defense, to see if it holds water, we really need to analyze the key drivers they cite as justification for seizing power. What are the main pillars we need to test against reality, according to the analysis?
The analysis highlights four main justifications consistently used by these juntas. First, deepening insecurity crises. That's usually number one. Second, massive corruption and just plain bad governance. Third, the lack of free, fair, and credible elections under the previous regime. And fourth, foreign policy factors, particularly perceived negative foreign interference.
Right. So every subsequent action these regimes take, or perhaps fail to take, becomes a test of these initial claims. Did they actually deliver?
Exactly. The rest of this deep dive is essentially holding them to account against their own promises.
Okay, let's start with the most immediate, the most visceral justification: insecurity. In a region that's, frankly, universally described as the epicenter of terrorism globally right now, the military's primary mandate, their core claim to legitimacy, should be restoring security and territorial integrity.
Absolutely. If they fail here, the entire edifice of their justification starts to look incredibly shaky.
And the analysis points to this being the undeniable singular catalyst in the two most recent coups in Burkina Faso, correct? The collapse of security provided the sort of moral cover for the military to intervene.
That's right. Take us through that Burkina Faso case study, because it really illustrates the cycle perfectly. Tragically, perhaps.
Okay. So insecurity was the primary driver cited for the initial January 2022 coup. That's the one that overthrew the elected president, Rose Marc Christian Kabore.
Right. And Kabore was widely, and many analysts would say justly, criticized for his administration's inability to combat the rapidly deepening security crises. These were driven mainly by groups affiliated with al-Qaeda, like JM, and also ISIS affiliates active in the Sahel. The military simply said, he can't do it, we can.
But the instability didn't stop there, did it? That initial military junta, the one led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, was itself very short-lived.
It lasted less than 9 months.
Which strongly suggests that the initial military solution didn't actually solve the problem and maybe instead just accelerated the political chaos.
That is the core takeaway from the Burkina Faso situation, according to this analysis. Damiba himself was overthrown in a subsequent coup, another one, in September 2022. This one was led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré.
And the reason Traoré is cited for his coup?
It was the continued catastrophic failure of the prior military regime, Damiba's regime, to deliver on that core security promise. By September 2022, when Traoré seized power, the analysis indicates the Damiba-led regime had lost control of a staggering 40% of Burkina Faso's national territory to militant groups. 40%.
Wow. So the pattern is tragically clear. A security failure justifies the first coup, and then continued, even amplified, security failure justifies the next coup.
Exactly. Each intervention makes the underlying problem worse, creating the pretext for further intervention.
And this pattern, military intervention supposedly to fix security, followed by worsening insecurity, it extends beyond just Burkina Faso, right? It's a regional theme.
Absolutely. Insecurity was also cited as a major underlying reason behind Mali's coups in 2020 and 2021. And again, most recently in Niger's 2023 coup. The narrative offered to the people, and often to the international community initially, is always similar. The civilian governments were weak, maybe corrupt, unable to fight effectively. We, the military, are the only ones capable of fighting the militants and restoring order.
Okay, here's where the data gets really interesting and, frankly, alarmingly contradictory to that narrative. Despite all this political upheaval, despite replacing civilian governments with self-proclaimed security experts, military juntas, the region is still the epicenter of terrorism globally.
It is.
And the data seems to show the situation hasn't just stabilized, it has fundamentally and measurably worsened since these military takeovers occurred.
The data shock is measurable, yes. We can use the Global Terrorism Index, the GTI rankings, which are produced annually by the Institute for Economics and Peace. The GTI measures the actual impact of terrorism. It looks at incidents, fatalities, injuries, property damage. So a higher ranking, a higher score, means a greater burden of terrorism on that society.
Okay, let's set the baseline then. What did the 2020 GTI show? This represents the context before or in the very early stages of this recent wave of coup.
Right. So back in 2020, Nigeria was the highest ranking country in the region on the GTI, sitting at number 4 globally with a score of 8.007 out of 10. Burkina Faso was ranked 6th with a score of 7.646, and Mali was 7th at 7.414.
So already dire numbers back then, reflecting a deeply impacted, very volatile region even before these coups really took hold.
Absolutely. The situation was already critical.
Now, compare that baseline to the latest 2024 GTI ranking. This is the data produced after these military regimes took charge and explicitly promised to fix the security crisis. What does it show?
The results show a catastrophic acceleration of the crisis, particularly within the coup states themselves. Burkina Faso, the very country where the initial coup was justified almost entirely on security failure, is now ranked number 1 globally.
Number 1. The most impacted country in the world.
Number 1 in the world with a score of 8.581. That score, combined with the rank, means, according to this index, it is now the nation most affected by terrorism globally. It surpassed even other traditional hotspots like Afghanistan or Syria in terms of current impact.
That is a staggering escalation, moving from 6th to 1st in just 4 years and under military rule. It strongly suggests the political instability caused by the coups has directly amplified the threat. It seems to have created a vacuum for terrorist groups to exploit.
That appears to be the case.
But how, maybe tactically or structurally, did the military regimes fail so spectacularly on their home turf, so to speak?
Well, this is the critical mechanism of failure, according to the analysis. When a military stages a coup, its primary focus immediately shifts. It pivots from external defense, fighting Janam or ISIS out in the provinces, to internal political control.
Securing their own power.
Exactly. Purging potential rivals within the armed forces, securing the capital city against counter-coups, consolidating their political authority. And what happens then? Resources, vital personnel, intelligence assets, vehicles, fuel, ammunition are diverted away from active counterinsurgency operations and towards essentially political maintenance and regime survival.
So the generals are busy looking over their shoulders, watching for rivals in the barracks, while the actual militants are busy taking territory out in the countryside.
That's a pretty accurate summary of the dynamic, yes. The ensuing political instability also tends to destroy regional and international counterterrorism cooperation. We'll definitely get into that later. But even just domestically, the military often loses morale, it loses focus, its operational effectiveness degrades.
And this created an ideal security vacuum.
An ideal security vacuum that these terrorist groups, particularly highly organized and adaptable ones like JNM, were perfectly positioned to exploit. And that exploitation, that increased operational tempo and territorial gain, leads directly to those exponential increases we see in the GTI scores.
What about the trajectory of the other main coup states in the Sahel, Mali and Niger?
Their rankings also worsened significantly. Mali moved up from 7th place in 2020 to 4th globally in the 2024 index. Niger, which experienced its coup most recently in 2023, saw a drastic jump. It went from 12th place in 2020 all the way up to the number 5 spot globally in the 2024 index.
So the entire heart of the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is now dominating the top 5 most terror-affected countries in the world.
That's correct. Nigeria, interestingly, moved down slightly from 4th to 6th, but the core Sahelian coup states are now clustered right at the top of the global list.
So the military's core justification, their primary promise, restoring security, it's not just failing. The data suggests it's measurably accelerating the very crisis they promised to solve. It almost sounds like they've inadvertently done the terrorists a favor by providing the political instability needed for their expansion.
The data is pretty unequivocal on this point. The military boots, in these specific contexts, are not stamping out the terror. They seem to be creating the conditions for it to flourish. And this profound failure of accountability in what should be their most critical area of competence is the first, and arguably the most damning, strike against their claim to be instituting true governance.
Okay, so the data clearly shows their security promise has been, well, a disaster. But if they couldn't win the war outside the capital, did they at least clean up the house inside the capital? Let's move to the second and third justifications. The claims about rooting out massive corruption and promoting good governance, and the related promise of restoring fair elections.
Right, the narrative here was initially quite compelling, wasn't it? Military governments in Niger, Mali, Guinea, they all publicly denounced the deposed civilian administrations. They painted them as systems riddled with endemic corruption, terrible mismanagement, just a complete lack of good governance.
And the juntas positioned themselves as the necessary moral cleaning force, the stern, incorruptible soldiers stepping in temporarily to restore integrity to the state.
Exactly, that was the pitch. We're here to clean house before handing back to civilians. So naturally, we need to ask, did they actually deliver on that promise of cleaner governance? What does the measurable data from indices like Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, the CPI, tell us about real change post-coup?
Right, the CPI. That's crucial here.
It is. The reality check, based on the CPI, reveals general stagnation or, at best, very marginal improvements. The CPI, just to remind listeners, assesses the perceived level of public sector corruption, drawing on insights from experts and business people. The scores run from 0, meaning highly corrupt, up to 100, meaning very clean.
And critically, a score under 50 signifies serious systemic corruption issues. Right?
That's the threshold, yes. So if these military governments were truly successful in cleaning house, we should expect to see significant movement towards that 50 mark, and ideally well above it over time.
Okay, so what did we find for Niger, the most recent coup state?
Niger currently ranks 107th out of 180 countries assessed globally. Its CPI score is 34 out of 100. Now, critically, this is actually a slight, very marginal improvement. It's up 2 points from their score of 32 back in 2022, just before the coup.
Wait a minute. If their entire justification rests on the idea that the civilian regime was a complete failure, doesn't that small upward trend in Niger, however tiny, complicate the narrative a bit? Or is that marginal gain simply irrelevant noise in the face of widespread institutional failure?
That's an excellent point, and exactly where nuanced analysis is crucial. A 2-point improvement, statistically speaking, is marginal. It's barely outside the margin of error for these kinds of indices. And a score of 34 out of 100 still means they are far, far closer to perceived total systemic corruption, 0, than they are to perceived clean governance, 100.
So for the average citizen...
For the average citizen in Niger, that marginal 2-point CPI bump is likely completely irrelevant if the underlying structural economic crises persist. And Niger still struggles immensely with socioeconomic issues. Most notably, it has one of the highest rates of youth unemployment in Africa. Without addressing that fundamental economic distress, which itself fuels corruption and instability, a 2-point CPI bump feels purely cosmetic. It doesn't change lived reality.
Okay, fair enough. What about the other primary coup states, Mali and Guinea? They've had military rule for a bit longer now.
Right. Mali ranks even lower, down at 135th out of 180 countries. Its score is a mere 27 out of 100. And critically, looking at the trend, Mali's CPI performance has been generally stagnant since the military takeovers began in 2020-21. They scored 29 in 2021, then 28 in 2022, and 28 again in 2023.
Stagnation at such a very low level.
Exactly. Stagnation meaning consistent, pervasive corruption, according to perceptions. This definitively suggests the military regime has done little or nothing to fundamentally alter the corrupt state processes it so loudly criticized its predecessors for.
And Guinea, where the coup was partly triggered by civilian frustrations over President Condé attempting to secure an unconstitutional third term. How have they fared on corruption?
Guinea ranks 133rd, very close to Mali, with a CPI score of 28 out of 100. Now, they have seen a slightly larger improvement than Niger, a 3-point gain from their score of 25 just before the coup in 2021.
Still marginal, though.
Still marginal, yes. And the overall ranking remains abysmal, placing them deep in the bottom third of all countries surveyed globally. Again, no evidence of a transformative cleanup.
The conclusion on governance efficiency seems to back this up too, right? The CPI measures the perception of corruption. What about the state's actual competence, its structural effectiveness, the very definition of good governance?
For that, yeah, we can turn to other indices. like the Solubility Governance Efficiency Ranking. This tries to measure the structural effectiveness of the state machinery itself. How capable is the government of actually delivering basic services, managing resources effectively, maintaining infrastructure?
And the results there.
The results are, frankly, brutal.
Yeah.
And they show absolutely zero signs of a post-coup cleanup or efficiency drive. Mali is ranked 173rd globally, Niger is 158th, and Guinea is ranked 181st out of 191 countries assessed.
Wait, 181st out of 191. That places Guinea among the 10 least efficient, least effective governments in the entire world.
That's what that particular index suggests, yes.
Yeah. So that definitively shows that even after the coups, these nations remain structurally among the least capable of performing the basic duties of a functioning state.
The evidence, when you look at both perception, CPI, and structural efficiency, seems conclusive. The promise to clean up corruption and establish better governance has resulted in, at best, statistically marginal score improvements for some, but absolutely zero fundamental structural change in terms of efficiency. And you still see stagnation or even worsening on major social fronts like youth unemployment. So the second justification, fixing bad governance, is clearly failing the reality test based on this data.
Okay, that failure then brings us to the third justification, and this one is arguably the most cynical reversal of their initial promises. The commitment to democratic participation, primarily through elections. The military regimes always claim they are merely temporary caretakers, just restoring order so that true governance, with its emphasis on participation, can eventually flourish through popular will.
Yes, this is the moment where the rhetoric often completely collapses under scrutiny. We have to revisit the legal requirements first, though. Both the ECOWAS protocol and the AU's AZDG charter mandate periodic elections as a fundamental non-negotiable feature of a functioning democratic system within their member states.
They're supposed to set the roadmap for a transition back to civilian rule.
Right. That's the explicit requirement. Set a clear, time-bound transition plan culminating in credible elections.
So what happened to those promises? What happened to restoring democracy and enabling participation?
What seems to have transpired, according to the analysis, is the systematic replacement of participation with the consolidation of military power. The juntas haven't just postponed elections indefinitely in some cases. In others, they have actively rewritten the legal framework of the state, the constitution, or equivalent charters to explicitly ensure long-term military control.
So they've systematically reneged on their initial promises to hold free, fair, and credible elections.
That appears to be precisely what's happening.
Let's detail those specific reneging actions, starting with Mali, which was kind of first domino to fall in this recent wave back in 2020.
Right. Mali's junta initially announced a transition period, then extended it, ultimately setting a 2-year delay for the return to democratic rule. That deadline expired earlier in 2024. And as of the time of this analysis, there is still no clear, definitive, agreed-upon transition plan back to civilian rule. The military remains firmly in control. This perpetual ambiguity, this lack of a concrete timeline, effectively maintains their power indefinitely while claiming to still be in transition.
Okay, what about Niger, the latest country to fall in 2023? Are they following a similar path of ambiguity or something more explicit?
Niger appears to be following an even more explicit route towards institutionalizing military rule, moving quickly to establish a form of permanence. The military government leader there, General Chiani, was sworn in essentially as head of state for a 5-year term starting in March 2025.
5 years?
5 years, yes. And this was done under a brand new national charter that entirely replaced the country's existing constitution. This wasn't just delaying an election. It was a deliberate, clear, institutionalized rejection of an immediate return to civilian rule. It effectively grants the military leader a full presidential term, completely outside of any democratic mandate or election.
Wow, okay. And Guinea, where, as we mentioned, the coup was partly triggered by civilian frustration over President Condé trying to hang on to power unconstitutionally. Is the junta now doing exactly what they condemned Condé for, but using legal manipulation?
It certainly looks that way. They are attempting to legitimize their own continued power by changing the rules to suit themselves. The Guinean regime amended the transitional constitution, specifically creating a loophole or provision that allows the leader of the military government, Colonel Doumbouya, to contest the upcoming civilian election whenever it eventually happens.
But isn't that exactly what those AU and ECOWAS rules we discussed were designed to prevent? The coup leader running in the election.
It's a direct, flagrant violation of that foundational principle of democratic governance in Africa. Article 25, Paragraph 4 of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, ACEG, strictly prohibits coup perpetrators from running in the subsequent elections designed to restore constitutional order. That rule exists specifically to deter coup by removing the personal incentive for the leader to hang on to power perpetually. Guinea's regime seems to be ignoring it.
Okay, and finally, Burkina Faso, the country under the greatest security pressure. What's their announced timeline for returning to civilian rule?
Reflecting perhaps the depth of their security crisis, but also arguably a long-term commitment to non-elected rule, the military junta in Burkina Faso formally extended its military rule for 60 months.
60 months. That's 5 years.
Another 5 years, yes, starting from July 2nd, 2024. So again, a very long time frame with no guarantee of elections even at the end of it.
The so what here seems absolutely devastating for their claims. The core principle of participation, which is essential to that definition of true governance they supposedly aspire to, has been completely replaced by the naked consolidation of power. The very actors who promised to fix the system have become the system.
Exactly. They've gone from presenting themselves as temporary transitional caretakers to acting like self-appointed long-term rulers, maybe even dictators in some cases. This completely undermines any possibility of them gaining legitimacy through popular consent or participation.
So if we look back at those 3 core criteria for true governance, we started with accountability, participation, and legitimacy. The military regimes seem to have failed every single test based on the data presented.
That's the conclusion the analysis reaches. Security has worsened, demonstrating a catastrophic failure of accountability in their primary claimed area of expertise. Elections and genuine political participation have been explicitly denied or indefinitely postponed, a total failure on participation. And therefore, their rule inherently lacks the legitimacy required to gain the full trust and cooperation of the population, which you need to tackle deep-seated issues like insecurity and corruption effectively.
Right. That sets the stage perfectly for the 4th and final justification they often use: foreign interference. This is the one that often resonates most powerfully domestically, the one used to drum up immediate popular support by tapping into deep historical grievances, particularly in the Francophone states.
Yes. This is where the domestic instability narrative meets the geopolitical chessboard. And the results, as we're seeing, are fragmenting the entire region.
The grievances were certainly real, weren't they? Accusations of Western political and military interference, particularly French interference, fueled by the painful legacy of colonialism and the sometimes controversial presence of French troops like Barkhane. That was a very effective local support driver for these coups, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It allowed the juntas to immediately leverage powerful nationalist, often anti-imperialist or anti-colonialist sentiment. The promise was simple: true sovereignty, freedom from external manipulation, taking back control.
But the analysis points to a deeply cynical policy reversal here as well. Once in power, what has the actual foreign policy of these new regimes looked like? Did they achieve that true sovereignty?
Well, the argument in the analysis is that the anti-Western ideology, while useful for gaining power, ultimately fueled a governmental cynicism. This led to foreign policy actions that actually run antithesis, as the source puts it, to their earlier stated goals of achieving genuine sovereignty and self-determination. They seem to be rejecting one specific form of external influence, mainly Western and particularly French influence, only to immediately replace it with another, often less transparent, less accountable foreign actor. And this shift frequently comes at a terrible cost to their own people.
Before we discuss the big geopolitical shift, can you detail that humanitarian cost? How has this isolationist shift directly impacted the people the juntas claim to be serving?
That's a critical point. In both Niger and Burkina Faso, the new regimes unilaterally forced several well-established international humanitarian and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to shut down their operations entirely. Sometimes they were accused of being spies or fronts for Western interests.
And the result?
The immediate result was the loss of critical local jobs provided by these NGOs. But far more critically, it severely deepened the existing humanitarian crises in those countries. These organizations were providing essential food aid, medical supplies, water purification, shelter, and support structures for millions of internally displaced people fleeing the conflict. Cutting them off had devastating consequences for vulnerable populations.
That's a staggering human cost inflicted by the government itself in the name of sovereignty. The defining foreign policy action, though, the one that gets the most headlines, was the dramatic shift in international alignment specifically, replacing one foreign military presence with another.
Yes, this is perhaps the most explicit challenge to the sovereignty justification. Following the expulsion of French forces, and in some cases other European or UN forces, from the affected countries Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, we saw the rapid establishment of forces backed by Moscow.
Initially through the Wagner Group.
Initially through the Wagner Group, yes, under Prigozhin, and now following Wagner's sort of fragmentation after Prigozhin's death, through the newly established structure, known often as the Africa Corps, which is seen as more directly linked to the Russian state military apparatus.
And these Russian forces establish a military presence in these territories, often under very opaque security agreements.
Extremely opaque. The terms of these agreements, what exactly these forces are doing, who they answer to, what rules of engagement they follow, it's often completely unclear, far less transparent than the previous arrangements with Western forces or the UN.
And this simple replacement of one set of foreign forces with another has immediate legal implications on a regional scale, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It arguably violates regional security agreements, like the Accra Initiative frameworks, which are designed to coordinate and govern foreign military presence within the region, ensuring transparency and alignment with broader regional security strategies agreed upon by member states.
So the replacement suggests the goal wasn't really true national sovereignty, removing all foreign boots, but merely a change of strategic patron. A pivot away from partners who might ask awkward questions about human rights or democracy towards one perhaps less concerned with those issues.
That's certainly one interpretation strongly suggested by the sequence of events. The goal appears to be regime security and alignment, rather than principled non-alignment or pure sovereignty.
This external shift, this pivot, has also resulted in major regional fragmentation, hasn't it? Specifically, the withdrawal of these coup states from ECOWAS, which directly undermines those legal deterrents we discussed at the very beginning.
Precisely. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, all now under military rule, all sharing this anti-Western, pro-Russian ideological bent, have formally announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS. And again, they cited similar accusations of illegitimate foreign interference within ECOWAS itself, accusing the bloc of being manipulated by external powers, namely France.
And they've subsequently formed their own counterbloc.
Yes, they've formed their own alliance, the Association of Sahel States, or AES, Alliance des États du Sahel.
How does the formation of the AES and this withdrawal from ECOWAS practically affect regional stability and the fight against terrorism?
This fracturing is potentially devastating for regional efforts. Firstly, it significantly weakens the existing regional legal and economic instruments designed to uphold norms and facilitate trade. But most critically, from a security perspective, it destroys essential security cooperation.
Like intelligence sharing.
Intelligence sharing, coordinated border control operations, joint military task forces, all the practical cooperation that is absolutely vital to effectively counter highly mobile transnational terrorist organizations like JNIM or ISWAP that operate across these very borders. By withdrawing and forming their own bloc, they seem to prioritize ideological alignment with each other over practical counterterrorism efficacy with their neighbors.
An action which likely contributes directly to that failure we saw reflected in the worsening GTI rankings.
It's highly likely, yes. Fragmented responses are ineffective responses against a unified enemy.
And their rejection of external norms didn't stop at the regional level. They also turned their sights on the global judicial system, specifically withdrawing from the International Criminal Court, the ICC. Why that move?
They publicly described the ICC as a tool of neo-colonialist repression, echoing criticism sometimes heard from other African leaders. This move likely serves two primary purposes for the regimes.
Which are?
First, it helps insulate the regimes and their security forces from potential international scrutiny and accountability for human rights abuses that might occur during their counterinsurgency operations or political crackdowns. The ICC is, after all, a court of last resort for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
And the second purpose?
Second, it again leverages that nationalist anti-Western sentiment domestically. It plays well to portray the ICC as an external imposition infringing on national sovereignty. In place of adherence to international justice standards, the regimes announced vague plans to establish their own local criminal courts supposedly rooted in local realities, though the details remain unclear.
Okay. So let's recap. On all four fronts that the juntas used to justify their coups, security, corruption governance, elections participation, and foreign policy sovereignty. The analysis suggests they have largely failed to meet the standards of true governance they promised.
That's the picture painted by the data and actions assessed in the source material. Yes.
They seem to have worsened security, making the region the global epicenter of terrorism. They've largely failed to curb corruption or improve governance efficiency in any meaningful way. They've explicitly denied political participation by entrenching military rule and manipulating electoral laws. And they've simply traded one set of foreign entanglements and dependencies for another, arguably less transparent one, while alienating regional partners.
The data is quite definitive on these trends. The interventions, which were launched under the pretense of restoring order and promoting government efficacy, seem instead to have amplified chaos, consolidated authoritarian power, and deepened the region's already profound humanitarian and security crises.
And the political fragmentation caused by these moves, the withdrawal from ECOWAS, the formation of the AES, is now having immediate, violent, and measurable spillover effects beyond their borders.
Exactly. Which brings us to the final part of our analysis today.
Right. That brings us to part 5. Let's pivot sharply now to the most recent and, frankly, alarming development discussed in the source material. This comes from a breaking intelligence report from Fulcrum Analytics, dated November 2nd, 2025. And this links the regional destabilization we've just spent time detailing directly to an immediate expanding terrorist threat.
This is where the sort of theoretical analysis of governance failure becomes brutally kinetic reality on the ground. The political and security vacuum created, or at least exacerbated, by the collapse of effective ECO-West cooperation in the Sahel is actively being filled by highly capable and ambitious extremist groups.
And this immediate threat update concerns al-Qaeda's main branch in West Africa, Jama Nusrat ul-Islam was al-Muslimin, usually known as JNI. What is the specific allegation in this breaking intelligence that has such serious national security implications for the entire region?
On October 31st, 2025, according to the report, a video allegedly from JI began circulating widely online. In this video, the group purportedly claims credit for its first ever attack inside Nigeria.
Inside Nigeria, that's huge.
If confirmed, this expansion into Nigeria is arguably the most critical recent security development in West Africa. Given Nigeria's sheer size, its population, its economic importance, and its role as an anchor state in ECOWAS.
Can you just remind the listener of JNI's existent footprint so they can really grasp the significance of this potential geographical breach into Nigeria?
Sure. JNI is absolutely not just a localized group fighting in one country. It's a powerful transnational threat. They're already deeply entrenched and highly active across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, 3 core AES states we've been discussing.
Right.
But their operational reach already extends beyond the Sahel. They've conducted attacks or have known cells in several coastal West African nations too, countries like Benin, Ghana, and Togo. These are ECOWAS member states. So JNI already represents a significant challenge to the stability of the entire ECOWAS region.
So if confirmed, an attack inside Nigeria represents what? A massive geographical expansion.
A massive geographical expansion, yes, into West Africa's most populous nation, and a country that, while certainly struggling with its own internal security challenges, particularly Boko Haram and ISWAP in the northeast, has been relatively politically stable compared to its immediate Sahelian neighbors recently. There hasn't been a successful coup there in decades.
The incident itself allegedly occurred in a place called Nuku in Kwara State, Nigeria. For listeners who might not be familiar with Nigeria's geography, what does an attack in Kwara State imply strategically?
Kwara State is significant because it's centrally located within Nigeria. It borders Benin to the west, but importantly, it sits just north of Nigeria's major southwestern population centers, including Lagos, the economic heart of the country.
So it's not the far north where ISWAP Boko Haram are usually most active.
Exactly. If JN is successfully penetrating Kwara State, it implies they are potentially bypassing or overcoming traditional security defenses concentrated along the far northern borders. It suggests they might be establishing operational reach much further south than previously thought.
Which places pressure on Nigeria's internal security architecture in a new way.
A completely new way, yes. And it signals a clear intent, perhaps, to challenge the entire ECOWAS region more broadly, not just focusing on the fractured Sahel states where they've had more freedom to operate recently.
What details do we have about the propaganda itself? The video used to claim credit.
The evidence circulating, as described in the intelligence report, is this video. It was reportedly taken in a forested area, which is typical terrain for these groups' operations. The key element is the narration by the cameraman. He explicitly claims credit for the group, reportedly referring to Jamaah Nusrat ul-Islam was al-Muslimin by name.
And they show proof of the attack.
Yes, the video apparently shows seized items, weapons, ammunition, maybe some military equipment displayed as proof of a successful engagement, presumably against Nigerian security forces.
So the propaganda message is clear. JNM has arrived, they've successfully breached the internal security of Nigeria, and they've captured spoils to prove it. However, we absolutely must stress the critical caveat here regarding the verification status of this claim, especially when dealing with real-time intelligence.
That is absolutely essential. The intelligence report is careful to note that at the time the report was issued, JNM's official propaganda outlet, that's usually Azalaka Media, had not released an official statement or any video with their official branding confirming this specific claim in Kwara State.
So, while the video is circulating and it explicitly claims JNM credit, official validation from the group's central command is still pending.
Correct. This highlights the fluidity and, frankly, the uncertainty that always characterizes real-time intelligence gathering in these complex conflict zones. Analysts have to maintain a degree of skepticism until official confirmation is received, either from the group itself or through corroborating evidence.
Understood. Yet, even an unconfirmed but widely circulated claim of JNM expanding into Nigeria, a country already dealing with significant internal security challenges, strongly indicates that the political and military vacuum created or worsened by the Sahelian coups is fundamentally changing the security landscape for the entire region. The instability is clearly contagious.
It seems to be. And if we try to connect all these threads back to the bigger picture, the crisis of governance we started with is starkly clear. True governance, as defined, requires accountability, participation, and legitimacy.
Right.
The military regimes assumed power, claiming they would fix the existing flaws, often through the barrel of a gun. But the available data over the past few years, as laid out in the Fulcrum analysis, shows a comprehensive failure across the board when measured against those very criteria.
They failed the accountability test in security, didn't they? Presiding over a situation where their countries became the world's epicenter of terrorism based on objective GTI data.
A clear failure of accountability there. Then, they explicitly denied participation, didn't they? Through entrenching long-term military rule, canceling or indefinitely postponing elections, and manipulating constitutional frameworks.
A failure of participation.
Absolutely. And therefore, logically, their rule inherently lacks the popular legitimacy necessary to effectively address the profound social, economic, and security needs of their people in the long run. You can rule by force for a while, but it's not sustainable or effective governance.
So what's the path forward, according to the analysis?
The source material offers a clear recommendation based on this documented failure. The only viable path forward for the AES states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, is a peaceful, negotiated transition back to civilian rule. And this transition needs to be in line with the existing regional and continental instruments, particularly those of ECOWAS and the AU that they've rejected.
Why is that seen as the only way?
Because only that move, returning to constitutional order and democratic norms, can restore the necessary political legitimacy both domestically and internationally. Only that can allow for their reintegration into essential regional security cooperation frameworks. And only that offers any real prospect of halting and hopefully reversing the exponential rise of terrorism that we've seen under military rule.
This whole situation raises a really important, maybe unsettling question for you, the listener, to consider as you process all this data. Given the documented failure of the military juntas in the AES states, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, to control terrorism, a failure dramatically reflected in their worsening GTI rankings, what does the reported expansion of JNM into Nigeria potentially tell us about the future of security cooperation in West Africa? Remember, Nigeria is relatively more stable politically, but still high on that GTI list itself.
It's a critical question. The regional security framework is clearly fragmenting along political and ideological lines. And these transnational terrorist groups are nothing if not opportunistic. They exploit division and weakness. So you have to ask, is this new association of Sahel states bloc realistically capable of defending itself, let alone ruling back this expanding threat, especially if their regimes remain primarily focused on internal political consolidation and survival? Or will Nigeria and the remaining relatively stable ECOWAS states be increasingly forced to step up, not just defending their own borders from attacks spilling over from these politically destabilized coup states, but perhaps having to project stability into those states to prevent the entire region from collapsing?
The failure of the coups to deliver on their promises seems to have transformed what were initially national governance crises into a potentially region-wide security conflict.
It really does look that way. It's a trend line that you absolutely need to keep watching closely in the coming months and years.
That is going to wrap up this week's Essential Intelligence Briefing on the complex West African governance paradox. We really appreciate you tuning in for this deep dive on Fulcrum Intel Digest.
And for more expert analysis, geopolitical reporting, and the latest intelligence briefings, including links to the specific sources and data points we discussed today, like the GTI and CPI reports, be sure to check out the Fulcrum Analytics blog, and of course, the rest of our YouTube channel.
We really do rely on your support and your curiosity to keep tackling these critical global issues and delivering this kind of high-level analysis. Until next time, stay informed.